This presentation focuses on how our designs can reduce the impact of catastrophes. Resilience comes from preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. Of the different types of catastrophes, some are sudden and intense, others are gradual, and some have social causes. All of them affect people and the environment in different ways, and it's worth noting that many catastrophes are compounded. For instance, floods are intensified by the sea water level rising and by deforestation. Let's have a look at the most intense catastrophes, not because they're going to be the worst, but only because they are the quickest, and so we have less time to prepare. Most natural disasters give us some warning, perhaps a few minutes or a few days, that a tsunami or a lava flow or a hurricane is on its way. But there's no warning, or not much warning, for an earthquake. This can happen at any time. That means you have to be prepared at all times, because you never know when the next one is coming. Earthquakes can be aggravated by fracking and bombing. This has been documented in the USA as far back as 1950. One way to design to avoid the impact of earthquakes is to look at how the cultures that live with a constant threat of earthquake survive. Earthquakes are common in Japan, New Zealand, and California. Here is the famous cardboard church in Christchurch, New Zealand. It's strong enough to withstand an earthquake, but light enough not to be a threat to the congregation. Important preparations for earthquakes means that we need better building standards. We need to stockpile emergency rations and invest in communication devices that don't require towers or electricity. Now let's have a look at floods. Floods are aggravated by deforestation because the trees that held the soil together are gone, and so the silt and the soil washes into the valley. But they're also aggravated by high tide and by the water level rising. Sometimes floods are caused by poor design of dams and poor management of the dams, and these dams have burst. Now, floods do build fertile soil. Most of the fertile land that's used for agriculture was at some time flooded, and the beautiful, rich nutrients from the mountains and the forest has come down into the plains. So we have a general tendency to want to settle on flat land next to a freshwater stream and grow crops on this fertile soil. But when storms come, that beautiful freshwater creek can rise and flood the area. So in response, we would build up higher, and many cities are just up at this level. But with deforestation, silt builds up with each rain event, and when the next storm comes, the flood level is higher. So how do we avoid flood impact? We locate homes and shelters above the flood line, above the extreme level of the flood line. We enable animals to seek their own refuge on high ground, and make sure that that area on high ground has some feed for them. We save seeds and we keep plants in a variety of locations. Provide a high refuge area with feed for the animals. Clear the escape routes and find a way for them to get there in a hurry. Ensure that the gates and fences of your designs can collapse in a catastrophe to allow the animals to escape and find their own refuge. It's quite bizarre that often the animals know that a catastrophe is coming long before people do. Now let's have a look at storms, tornadoes, and cyclones. The way to avoid the impact of a storm involves the shape of the house and the position of it out of high wind, and also to cut any overhanging branches and reduce the amount of debris that's flying around. When there's a tsunami, we do get a funny kind of warning where the ocean recedes. It's as if it's extremely low tide. At that point, we need to run to high ground or up a tree. There's not much we can do to avoid the impact of a landslide, except research the history of the area before we settle there. It's good to be aware that landslides are aggravated by deforestation, mining, and the sea level rising, especially on the coastlines. Wildfires destroy habitat, the nation's resources, and importantly, carbon sequestration. Whatever was locked up in the soil and the forest is released with wildfire. And it also pollutes the rivers and the oceans. Not to mention, of course, all the homes, the people's lives and their livelihoods are lost. And there are aggravators for wildfire. Global warming is one of the biggest aggravators. Drought, arson, and then there's poor forest management. And we're only just rediscovering the wisdom of the elders with their traditional forest management techniques. So we can avoid the impact of a fire by improving the housing, making it fireproof. There are many issues in a fire, many threats. There's the heat, there's radiation, noise, smoke and ash, and there's also flying debris. All of these need to be factored in if you're designing for a fire risk area. To prevent fire, we need better water supplies, fire retardants and reflectors, and traditional cool burning methods. Now let's have a quick look at toxic waste. To avoid toxic waste, we need accountable governance because it's not something one individual can do well. But the only thing an individual can do is make sure there's no toxic waste on their site, and they certainly don't want to buy it. And to know what's toxic and what's not requires information and healthcare. To prevent toxic waste, we actually need to engage in advocacy and researching alternatives and fighting for peace, because wars generate a lot of toxic waste. Let's have a quick look at the gradual types of catastrophes that our sites might face. Plagues, pests and parasites, viruses and disease. These are invisible catastrophes. The way to avoid the impact of pests and disease is to explore integrated pest control, healthcare, animal welfare and nutrition. The way to prevent pests and disease is through sanitation, wildlife management, research and education. And if we don't deal with poverty and overcrowding, we will continue to face these issues. Now let's have a look at heat waves. Heat waves affect people in cultures that it's just so not used to having them. The architecture's not right for a heat wave. The homes hold the heat and they don't have great ventilation. Trees reduce the city heat by producing shade and keeping moisture in the air. And some cities like Seville are designed for the buildings to shade the streets in the hottest time of the day. For the drought, we want to store water in the soil as much as possible, shade it to reduce evaporation and diversify our plant selection. There are some global catastrophic issues. Ozone loss is generated by mankind. It has an unequal impact. Not every area in the world is suffering from this in the same way. And unfortunately, the world guidelines are still ignored by some developing countries. These guidelines have banned the use of CFCs and other chemicals that deplete ozone, and yet they're still being generated. Climate change has happened before, but it has not been as rapid. The changes we see today are so rapid that few species have the opportunity to adapt. Some species, like cockroaches, are more adaptable than others. But most life forms that we know today are going extinct. Climate change is also affecting one country more than another. For instance, people who live in warm countries will get hotter and have fewer local foods. As I present this today, the people of Mauritius are starving. Their crops have failed and the plagues of locusts are what they're eating. One of the biggest shocks with climate change is the extreme weather events it generates, and they cause a lot of harm. The sea level rise is something that's quite tricky to understand because we're not living on a flat earth, and so the water doesn't rise the same all the way around the world. It rises more in some places than others. There's quite a few resources online now for you to map the seawater rise and its impact on your region. Now let's have a look at social catastrophes and how they impact on the environment. Wars create physical and chemical damage, noise, stress and species loss. Economic collapse harbours crime, unrest and untreated diseases. And it also leads to war. But at the end of all of this is the destruction of wildlife and habitat for income, such as ivory or exotic medicines. and for food, housing, and fuel. Famines are actually quite rapid, and there's great environmental destruction when people are starving. Land loss today comes from physical events, additional physical events such as the sea water level rising, snow melt in Nepal, tearing down and ripping the banks of the rivers in Bangladesh, for instance, and social conflicts. And today, humans are legally having to battle corporations. Corporations have more power than individuals. There are some general things that we can do to prepare for catastrophe, and they involve building our information and knowledge of the site, creating escape plans with a refuge, storing resources, and creating backups of our plants and animals, making sure that we have efficient transport and means for them to get to safety, communication, and cooperation within the community. Education is vital in finding a way to survive the next catastrophe. Cooperation is also extremely important because there will be limited resources, regional isolation, and poor communication outside that region. There are 5 things that this planet needs to continue to support life. It needs clean air, clean water, clean soil, clean oceans, and genetic material. Many people forget about the need for genetic material. Our designs need to keep genetic material in diverse places in case one of the areas fails. Then we have a backup. Sharing our resources helps us to put the preservation of genetic material in lots of people's hands. A catastrophe is usually a natural event, but what makes it a catastrophe is when people and other living beings are injured. Some catastrophes are aggravated by human intervention, such as fracking, ozone depletion, and pollutants. We have the capacity to design, to avoid and prevent most of these risks if we understand them better and act with kindness, especially to people living with poverty, land loss, and poor living conditions.